It's been a summer of unrest in a number of cities across the country, and just how and when police use so-called less lethal force is a topic of much debate, as we report in our cover story. The demonstrations in Kenosha, Wisconsin streets in the name of Jacob Blake started, as most protests do, peacefully. But as day turned to night, simmering tensions boiled over, tempers were lost, and so was the message. For police, balancing the right to assemble with public safety is a delicate one.
Move to the north or to the west now.
If and when crowds get out of control, the weapons at their disposal are designed to be less lethal. But in the weeks of unrest since the death of George Floyd, it's not just violent agitators being targeted by beanbag rounds and phone-tipped projectiles. It's the innocent who are being injured as well. Take this protest in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, back in May. 34-year-old LaToya Ratliff was there. Was it peaceful?
It was very peaceful. There weren't any issues for the most part of the day.
But something changed. She wasn't sure just what at the time, but clearly the mood had shifted.
We were kneeling on the ground, a good distance away from the officers. And even as we were kneeling and chanting and being peaceful, at that time, we started to get tear gassed.
The crowd dispersed, including LaToya. That's her wearing a pink backpack. But watch what happens next.
What is that for?
LaToya was shot in the head by a 40-millimeter foam-tipped round, fired, her attorney says, by a Fort Lauderdale police officer. The impact fractured LaToya's skull. She needed 20 stitches.
And I remember people screaming and saying, help, she's been hit, call 911. In my mind, I'm not thinking that I was shot, because why would the officer shoot me if I'm not posing any type of threat to him and I'm actually leaving?
You got it in the head!
Hers is not a unique or isolated incident.
I didn't realize how big of a deal it was until there was surgeons around me.
Linda Tirado is a freelance journalist sent to cover the George Floyd protests in Minneapolis. She's a veteran of this kind of reporting. She was in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014 after another police killing, this one of Michael Brown.
There's a space where the protesters are gathered in a group and police are gathered in their line, and the people who are in between in that space are going to be media. And that's how you get that understanding of what's going on, is you stand and you watch both sides.
That's what she was doing in Minneapolis that night. This is the last photo she took, what appears to show an officer aiming directly at her.
I think that not shooting people in the face for exercising the first thing we fixed about the Constitution should just be standard operating procedure.
The non-lethal round shot at Linda that night blinded her in her left eye.
So I can see to about here. And everything from here to here is just blank. I'm assured that as I become used to having one eye, I'll be able to do all the things I used to do without it being a problem. But the getting used to only having one eye is not a small task.
To be sure, police have been injured in the protests too. Hundreds of them. More than 50 on one particularly violent night in Seattle recently. Crowds can be dangerous. Dispersing them is often necessary. But the research on the lethality of less lethal weapons is pretty hard to come by. In 2017, a review of the available literature on the subject was published in the medical journal BMJ Open. Of the nearly 2,000 people since 1990 documented to have been injured by less lethal rounds, 300 suffered permanent disability. 53 of them died.
These are large, dense, high-speed projectiles, and they cause significant and severe injuries.
Dr. Rohini Har is with Physicians for Human Rights and one of the authors of that review.
The basic rights, like free speech and free assembly, are being suppressed globally, and the primary way that that's happening is because of crowd control weapons.
In just the first week after the death of George Floyd, Har documented at least 100 serious injuries to protesters and journalists, most to the head and neck.
The narrative is that they're not lethal, they're not dangerous, that police need a continuum of use of force, and that these are really excellent options for them to be safe while at the same time controlling riots.
And that's not the case?
It's absolutely not the case.
While most police departments have access to less lethal weapons, experts say few are offered any significant training on just how to use them.
I've talked to agencies, we've never seen crowd control before, we didn't even know what to do. These are 40 millimeter impact munitions.
Travis Norton is an instructor with the California Association of Tactical Officers. He specializes in less lethal weapons, not only how to use them, but when.
How do you deal with a group of agitators in the middle of peaceful protesters?
There are a lot of different tactics you can use. Unfortunately, a lot of those departments don't know what those tactics are. What are we trying to accomplish with what we're trying to do? Are we just standing here on the skirmish line and deploying impact munitions at protesters hoping they'll go away, or do we have an actual strategy here?
Rules of engagement, he says, have to be set because the risk of injury is almost inevitable. Unlike live ammunition, less lethal projectiles are unpredictable. Where an officer aims and where the munitions hit can be two different things.
Law enforcement is screaming for something better for us to use that's out there. In the last 20 years, we have had no new, less lethal come out other than prototypes and pilot projects.
Until something better comes along, he says, less lethals will likely remain a crowd control option for police departments. What doesn't have to remain, he says, is the cloud around their use.
A lot of times what happens in law enforcement is these things will happen and then we just forget about them because we're on to the next emergency. And it's not purposeful, it's just we don't have a lot of time to reflect on things and we have to do better at that.
Got in the head!
Despite her injuries, LaToya Ratliff has kept demonstrating. Peaceful protest is in her DNA, literally. Fannie Lou Hamer, a hugely influential civil rights leader back in the 1960s, is LaToya's great-aunt. She, too, was bloodied in her battles. Less lethal munitions were meant to be a step forward from those dark days. But, like the fight for civil rights itself, that work is not over.
It was always taught to me early on that if you want to see change, if you want to see good in your community, that you have to be a part of it. I do think it's important to continue to participate because there's still so much change that needs to happen.